When I opened the bathroom door and saw him standing there, holding my bra with a look of quiet confusion, something inside me snapped, but not from shame. It was from the realization that I had let too much slip through the cracks. The bra wasn't supposed to be there. I had hidden it, I was sure of it. But there it was, red, lacy, unmistakably not the kind of thing a woman like me was supposed to wear anymore. Not for grocery runs. Not for quiet evenings at home. And certainly not when the only man who shared my bed hadn't touched me in weeks. I saw his eyes move from the garment to my face, and I watched the question form in his mind. Not jealousy. Curiosity. A chill ran down my spine as he opened his mouth to say something, but closed it again. Silence. Heavy, suspended. I stood there, towel slipping from my shoulder, wondering if this would be the moment everything unraveled. And yet, the worst part wasn't that I had left it out. The worst part was that I wanted him to find it. Because 3 weeks ago, something happened. Something I can't undo. And now I need to tell you the truth. Before I lose the chance to explain what really happened. But first, comment below, where are you watching this from? And tell me, have you ever done something you swore you'd never do, and realized it changed everything? It started with nothing. That's the part that still baffles me the most. No grand emptiness, no devastating betrayal. Just nothing. A quiet accumulation of absence. Like tiny moths chewing through the fabric of something that once held everything together. My husband was kind. Not cruel, not distant in any obvious way. He said thank you when I handed him his coffee. He kissed my forehead sometimes before leaving for work. We still laughed together, rarely, but we did. And yet, somewhere between mortgage payments and doctor visits, the string between us had gone slack. He didn't notice when I changed my haircut. Not because he was blind or careless. Just because he was busy. Always busy. The news, his emails, the lawn. I stopped asking him to look at me a long time ago. Then came the email from my sister. Her son, my nephew, had been accepted into a university just 20 minutes away from our home. Could he stay with us for a few weeks while he found housing? Of course, I wrote back, typing too quickly, too eagerly. I told myself it was just family. That it would be nice to have someone young in the house again. Energy. Movement. The day he arrived, I wore lipstick. Not on purpose, I told myself. It had just been a long time since I had any reason to. I watched from the window as he stepped out of the taxi, dragging his suitcase behind him, looking taller and older than I remembered. He smiled the moment he saw me, called me by name, hugged me tight. I noticed how warm he felt. How he smelled like detergent and something sharp, like cedar. I showed him to the guest room, helped him unpack. He was polite, gracious, just a little awkward in the way of someone trying not to intrude. Thank you for letting me stay, he said, his voice deeper than it used to be. I'll try not to be in the way. I laughed, said he wasn't in the way at all. I meant it. And I hated that I meant it. That first evening, we all had dinner together, my husband, my nephew, and I. I made roasted chicken, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving. My husband mostly scrolled through his phone. My nephew asked questions, about the house, about our town, about how we met. I hadn't told that story in years. I saw my husband glance up once or twice, but he didn't add anything. I carried the tale alone, suddenly aware of how fated it sounded when said out loud. After dinner, my husband went to the living room and turned on the news. I washed dishes. My nephew offered to help. I said no. He insisted. We stood at the sink, shoulder to shoulder. He dried. I scrubbed. His elbow brushed mine, and I moved away a little too quickly. He apologized. I laughed. We said nothing more. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling fan turning above us. He snored lightly. I thought about the elbow. The contact. How strange it was to even register it. The days passed. My nephew settled into a rhythm. Classes, part-time work, dinners at home. He always offered to help, in the kitchen, in the garden, bringing in groceries. He always looked me in the eye when he spoke. He laughed at my jokes. He complimented my cooking, sometimes even asked for the recipe. One afternoon, I caught him in the hallway, stepping out of the bathroom, hair wet, shirtless. I looked away immediately. So did he. Neither of us spoke about it. But I thought about it later, not the sight, but the way my heart jumped. The guilt I felt afterward wasn't because of what I saw, but because I wanted to see it again. I started spending more time in the garden. I liked the quiet, the distance. One evening, as I trimmed the rosemary, I heard footsteps. He was behind me, asking if he could help. I handed him the shears. Our fingers touched. I pulled away. He didn't comment, just took the shears and began clipping. Later that week, I went shopping alone. I walked slowly through the lingerie aisle. Not because I needed anything. Just looking. Touching the lace. Imagining what it might feel like again, to be seen. I bought one piece. Red. Not practical. Not something I'd worn in years. I told myself it was just for me. To feel something again. To remember. I hid it in the back of my drawer. And then I forgot to hide it better. That brings us back to the moment I opened the door and saw him standing there, holding it. The bra. Looking confused. And me, standing in nothing but a towel, freezing in place as 100 thoughts crashed through my head. But that's not where it really started. No, it started with silence. With absence. With the moment I stopped asking to be seen, and started needing it. And this is the story of everything that happened after. The morning after the bra incident passed with a strange kind of quiet. Not tension, not yet. But an awareness. An invisible hum that followed me into the kitchen and buzzed behind every glance exchanged across the room. My husband had left early for work, as always, without noticing anything unusual. My nephew, however, lingered longer than usual over his coffee. He didn't mention what he saw. Neither did I. And yet, everything between us had changed. I tried to go about the day normally. Laundry. Dishes. A grocery list I had been meaning to write for days. But even in the most mundane tasks, my thoughts drifted. Not to guilt, not entirely, but to the quiet realization that I was no longer invisible in my own home. That someone had seen something, a piece of me that had been buried for too long. In the afternoon, I was folding clothes in the guest room when he entered without knocking. I didn't hear his footsteps until he was right there in the doorway. He apologized quickly, stepping back as though he'd crossed a line. I waved it off, said it was fine, and continued folding. He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the frame of the door and began talking about a class he was struggling with. I listened, nodding, responding when needed. But I could feel the space between us shift again, not physically, but emotionally. Like a tide pulling at the edge of something unspoken. That evening, my husband came home late. He kissed me on the forehead, mentioned something about traffic, then disappeared into the bedroom to change. Dinner was quiet. My nephew helped set the table, and I could feel his presence more acutely than ever before. Every brush of his arm. Every time our eyes met. There was something in the way he looked at me, not disrespectful, not inappropriate, but aware. Later, after dinner, my husband went into the den to watch the game. I began washing the dishes. My nephew joined me again, drying plates without needing to be asked. This time, when our hands met as he took a wet bowl from me, I didn't move away so quickly. And neither did he. For a few seconds, we just stood there, our fingers overlapping around the ceramic. It was nothing. And it was everything. I pulled back first, but slowly. Deliberately. He said nothing. I focused on the soap suds running down the inside of the sink. We kissed. It happened without planning, without lead-up. One moment I was reaching for the towel, and the next, his hand brushed against mine again. Our eyes locked. There was a long pause, one I should have broken. But I didn't. We kissed. And then, as if realizing what we'd done, we stepped back almost at the same time. He left the kitchen without a word. I stood there, heart pounding, breathing shallow, towel still in hand, unsure whether to scream or cry or laugh. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to my husband, who snored softly, his arm draped casually over his side of the bed. I stared at the ceiling, at the way the light from the hallway spilled across the floor, and felt completely unmoored. What had just happened wasn't planned. It wasn't deliberate. But it wasn't accidental either. The next morning, I expected avoidance. Maybe even tension. But instead, he greeted me the same way he always did, with a small smile, a polite good morning, and a question about the coffee. He acted like nothing had happened. I tried to do the same. But I couldn't stop watching him. Noticing the way he sat, the way he walked, the way he laughed. Things I hadn't noticed before, not because they weren't there, but because I'd never let myself notice them. I cleaned the hallway closet that afternoon, just to keep my hands busy. I pulled out old coats, boxes of forgotten things, and a photo album I hadn't seen in years. I opened it, and there we were, my husband and I, smiling on a beach, arms around each other, sunburned and happy. A time before silence. Before routine. Before distance. I stared at the picture and felt something twist inside me. Not regret. But a kind of grief. For what we had been. For what we had lost without even realizing it. When I heard footsteps behind me, I quickly closed the album. My nephew stood at the edge of the hallway, watching me. He didn't ask what I was looking at. I didn't offer. We just stood there, the air between us thick with unspoken things. "Do you want help with that?" he finally asked, nodding toward the pile of coats. I shook my head, but thanked him. He didn't move. Instead, he said, "I don't want you to think I'm trying to make things weird." I looked up at him. His voice was steady, quiet. "I don't," I said. "But maybe they already are." We both knew what we meant. And we both knew we couldn't take it back. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Dinner was just the two of us. My husband had a late meeting. I made something simple. We talked about mundane things, traffic, weather, his classes. And yet, every second was loaded with what we weren't saying. That night, as I washed my face before bed, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. There was color in her cheeks. A spark in her eyes. Not youthful, not exactly, but alive. And that terrified me. Because I knew now that it wasn't just a moment. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a crack in the wall I'd spent years building. A hairline fracture that would grow, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. I went to bed early. My husband was still in the den. As I lay in the dark, I thought about all the things I could say. Should say. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, a part of me didn't want to stop it. And that part was starting to feel more like the real me than the woman I had been pretending to be. The morning light poured into the kitchen in streaks, casting long shadows across the counter as I stood there, unmoving, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee I had no desire to drink. The house was quiet. My husband had already left for work, slipping out before sunrise like he always did lately. He didn't kiss me goodbye. I didn't expect him to. We had long stopped pretending that mattered. I listened to the subtle sounds of the house, the humming refrigerator, the occasional creak in the ceiling, and waited. I waited for footsteps, for a presence, for something to disrupt the ache of anticipation that pulsed behind my ribs. When I finally heard him descending the stairs, I didn't look up right away. I stared into my mug and pretended not to notice the tightening in my chest. He entered the kitchen softly, as he always did, offering his usual, polite good morning. I murmured something in return, but my voice barely carried. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the opposite counter. For a moment, neither of us said a word. We sipped in silence, surrounded by the too loud quiet of unspoken memory. The day before, the kiss lingered like smoke in the air between us. Not a fire, not anymore. But something smoldering just beneath the surface. I busied myself with cleaning. Wiped the counters. Rearranged a fruit bowl that didn't need rearranging. Anything to avoid looking at him. But he didn't leave. And that, more than anything, told me that nothing was over. In the afternoon, my sister called. She asked how he was settling in. I told her he was doing well. That he was respectful, easy to live with. She laughed and said she always thought he was the most thoughtful of her kids. I smiled. My throat tightened. I changed the subject. Later, I found myself in the hallway with an armful of laundry, staring at the closed guest room door. I hesitated, then raised my hand to knock. I had no reason to. And yet, I wanted to hear his voice. Something in me needed to break the stillness. I lowered my hand before making contact and turned away. Outside, the garden called to me. I needed air. I needed space. I threw on a sweater and stepped into the backyard, letting the chill bite into my skin. The rosemary bushes had overgrown again. I reached for the shears, lost myself in the snipping of branches, the quiet rhythm of pruning something that had once thrived freely and now needed control. The metaphor didn't escape me. I didn't hear him approach. But I felt it, the shift in the atmosphere. That same invisible hum, alerting me to his nearness. He stood a few feet away, silent, hands in his jacket pockets, watching me. I can help if you want, he said eventually, nodding toward the shears. I didn't answer at first. I kept clipping. Then handed the shears to him without a word. Our fingers touched briefly. He accepted them, then kneeled beside one of the lower bushes, taking to the task as if it were something sacred. We worked side by side for a long time. The silence between us wasn't heavy this time. It felt careful. As if both of us were measuring every movement, every breath, in case it meant something more than it should. The neighbor's voice broke the spell. I looked up and saw her at the fence, waving. She was carrying a basket, fresh herbs, probably, or maybe vegetables from her small patch of earth. I waved back, trying to appear casual. She tilted her head, her gaze drifting from me to him and back again. Then she smiled, slow, curious, and said, "You're always out here working, huh?" I gave a light laugh and nodded. She didn't linger, but the look she gave me as she turned to leave sent a flicker of something uneasy down my spine. Later, as I returned to the kitchen to put the cuttings in water, I caught a glimpse of myself in the window reflection. Hair tousled. Cheeks flushed. Not the tired, faded woman I had grown used to seeing. Not someone new either. Someone in between. My husband came home that evening in a good mood. He brought takeout, claiming he felt bad that I was always cooking. I wanted to tell him that I didn't mind. That sometimes, cooking was the only part of the day that felt like mine. But I didn't. I just thanked him and set the table. Dinner passed with pleasant small talk. He talked about a client at work who couldn't decide on a roof color. My nephew chimed in with a joke. I smiled when I was supposed to. But all I could think about was the neighbor's glance. How sharp it felt. How loaded. After dinner, my husband went upstairs to take a call. My nephew and I cleaned the kitchen. We moved carefully around each other. Our hands never touched. Our eyes never lingered. But the energy between us buzzed like a wire stretched taut. As I dried the last dish, he finally said something. "We should talk," he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't look at him. I placed the dish in the cabinet and said, "There's nothing to talk about." He paused. Then nodded. I left the room before I could change my mind. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling again, listening to my husband breathe beside me. I wondered what he'd say if he knew. If he had seen that look between us. If he had picked up on the shift in the air. Would he yell? Leave? Forgive? Or worse, would he shrug and say it didn't matter? The thought made my stomach twist. I realized I wasn't afraid of the fallout. I was afraid of the confirmation that I had become something disposable. Something background. But this, whatever this was with my nephew, it had made me feel present. Real. Not because of what happened, but because for the first time in years, I had seen myself through someone else's eyes. And I didn't hate what I saw. Still, it was dangerous. I had to find a way to stop this, to draw the line, bury the temptation, return to the woman I had been. But as I closed my eyes and tried to picture that woman, she felt far away. Like a silhouette. A memory I wasn't sure how to bring back. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The following morning began with the sound of rain. Not a gentle drizzle, but a persistent tapping that echoed against the kitchen windows like 100 tiny fingers demanding attention. I stood barefoot on the cold tiles, watching the drops trail down the glass, blurring the trees into soft smudges of green and gray. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The house was still, the weight of silence familiar, comfortable even. My husband had left early again, mumbling something about a meeting, his travel mug half full on the counter where he'd forgotten it. I didn't call after him. I sipped my tea slowly, trying to stretch the moment into something meaningful, but the thoughts that had been circling in my head since the night before refused to quiet. The conversation, or what barely passed for one, between my nephew and me lingered in the corners of my mind like steam from a too-hot shower. "We should talk," he had said. But I had refused. I wasn't ready for clarity. Not when I still couldn't understand what this even was. He came down late that morning, his hair damp, shirt sticking slightly to his chest from the humidity. I focused on my cup. He poured his coffee, took a seat across from me, and didn't say a word. I appreciated that. The quiet between us wasn't hostile, but it was far from calm. It felt like we were both waiting for something, a break in the tension, a sign, maybe even permission. After breakfast, I threw myself into chores with a kind of manic focus. I vacuumed the hallway, scrubbed the bathroom sink, wiped the tops of cabinets no one would ever look at. But my body moved mechanically, and my mind wandered. Every squeak of the floorboards, every shift of air in the room made me hyper-aware of his presence in the house. It was unbearable and electrifying all at once. By the time the afternoon arrived, The rain had slowed to a lazy drizzle, and I needed to get out. I told myself I needed groceries, eggs, milk, something for dinner. But I think I just needed distance. I didn't ask if anyone wanted to come with me. I grabbed my keys and left without a word. The grocery store was quiet. A few older couples ambled through the aisles, their carts half full and conversations slow and meandering. I moved faster than usual, my cart filling with things I didn't really need. Crackers, 2 different types of cheese, fresh basil, a box of herbal tea I hadn't tried before. I avoided the wine aisle on purpose. When I got home, the house was quiet again. I almost thought he wasn't there until I heard faint music coming from the guest room, low, rhythmic, something acoustic. It felt oddly intimate, like walking in on someone's thoughts. I paused at the door but didn't knock. I just kept walking. As I unpacked the groceries, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, she stood there, our neighbor, with a smile too pleasant to be casual. She held a basket of herbs and a jar of something homemade, wrapped in a kitchen towel. "I was pruning the garden this morning and thought you might like some fresh mint," she said, her tone light but her eyes watchful. I invited her in, more out of politeness than desire. She stepped inside, looked around the kitchen, her gaze pausing briefly on the pair of coffee mugs in the sink. "Smells like rain," she said, settling into the chair near the window. "You know, I used to love days like this. Gave me an excuse to do nothing." I nodded, offering a small smile. I poured tea for both of us, and we talked about nothing, the weather, a recent road closure, how the squirrels had been more aggressive this year. But I could feel her circling something, as if waiting for a cue. And then she gave it to herself. "Your nephew seems very grown up," she said, gently stirring her tea. "Not a boy anymore." My hand paused mid-reach for a napkin. I looked at her. She didn't blink. "He helps out," I said simply. "We're glad to have him." "I'm sure," she said. Then, after a sip, added, "You seem different lately. Lighter." I felt the words press against my chest like a weight. "Maybe I'm just getting better sleep," I offered with a shrug. She didn't press. She never did. She just smiled, set down her cup, and thanked me for the tea. Before leaving, she paused at the door. "You know," she said, her voice softer, "secrets have a way of showing themselves. Even when we think we've buried them well." I didn't respond. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it for longer than I care to admit. That evening, I cooked with unnecessary attention to detail. Everything diced precisely. The sauce stirred continuously. It was a distraction I clung to. My husband came home late again. Dinner was quick. He complimented the food without much thought, then disappeared to his laptop. My nephew and I barely spoke. We moved around each other with the practiced coordination of 2 people pretending nothing had changed. But everything had. As I loaded the dishwasher, I could see him through the reflection in the kitchen window, leaning against the doorframe, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. When I turned, he looked away. We didn't speak. But the silence said too much. That night, lying in bed again, I stared at the ceiling. My husband's soft breathing beside me had become its own kind of lullaby, a rhythm of comfort and neglect. I wondered if he knew. Not consciously, perhaps, but deep down, some primal part of him sensing the shift. I reached for the book on my nightstand, but I didn't read. I just held it, trying to ground myself in something familiar. Something safe. But I couldn't shake her words. Secrets have a way of showing themselves. She had seen something. Or thought she had. Maybe it was a glance. A pause. A shared moment she recognized because she, too, had lived through one once. Women like us, we notice. We carry stories in our bones. I wondered what mine would become. Because now, no matter how carefully I moved, how quietly I breathed, the truth was already unfolding. And something told me, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The days that followed unfolded like a delicate balance between routine and risk. Mornings began with the same quiet shuffle of coffee mugs, the predictable clicks of cabinet doors, the faint sound of water boiling. The house had resumed its rhythm, outwardly undisturbed, but I felt the fragility of it with every passing moment. It was as though we were all walking across a frozen pond, unsure of which step might crack the surface beneath. I kept myself occupied, tasks that didn't need doing but gave my hands a purpose. Polishing doorknobs, organizing drawers, refolding already folded towels. Each small act became a form of penance, though I couldn't name the sin precisely. Nothing had happened, I told myself, at least nothing that couldn't be undone. But my body disagreed. It remembered the proximity, the look, the kiss. We kissed. Those two words echoed louder than I ever expected they would. Simple, contained. And yet, they carried the weight of something that couldn't be dismissed. We hadn't spoken of it since. I avoided being alone in the same room with him whenever possible. And when avoidance failed, I filled the air with conversation so trivial it barely qualified as speech. But silence was more dangerous. It gave space for awareness. One afternoon, my husband texted me to say he'd be away for a work dinner. The moment I read the message, a strange tightness gripped my chest, not because of what it meant for him, but because of what it meant for me. For the house. For the silence that would descend again between us. I spent the day preparing a meal that was too elaborate for just the two of us. Roasted vegetables. A lentil stew that simmered for hours. Fresh bread, which I needed until my arms ached. When he came into the kitchen, he raised an eyebrow at the spread but said nothing. He helped set the table, poured water into mismatched glasses, and sat down opposite me. We ate in near silence. Cutlery clinked. Chairs creaked. Outside, the wind shook the trees, casting shadows that danced across the walls like spectators. At one point, I looked up and caught him studying me. Not in a way that made me feel watched, but in a way that made me feel seen. It was brief. He returned to his plate, but the echo of that glance lingered longer than it should have. After we cleared the dishes, I found myself at the sink again, hands immersed in warm soapy water, watching the steam rise in curls that blurred the window. I heard his footsteps approach and willed myself not to tense. He stood beside me, took the dish towel, and began drying. Our movements fell into rhythm, just like always. But this time, there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable. We weren't pretending anymore. We were waiting. The silence grew unbearable, and I broke it with the only sentence I could trust to be neutral. "You have class tomorrow?" He nodded. "Yeah. Early lecture." I nodded too, rinsing another plate, passing it to him. "I might take the morning to go into town," I added, unsure why I said it. He didn't respond right away. "Then, do you ever just want to leave?" I paused mid-rinse. "Leave? Not permanently. Just disappear for a little while. Go somewhere no one expects you. Where you don't have to play a role." I didn't look at him. I placed the plate in the drying rack, slowly. "All the time," I said. That was the moment. I knew it. That was the moment something could tip, could shift from suggestion into action. But it didn't. We stood in that kitchen, the tension stretched so tightly between us that it was almost audible. But nothing broke. We didn't move closer. We didn't speak further. We just stood still. Eventually, he walked away. Later that night, I sat in the bedroom with a book in my lap and nothing on the page registering. My husband called. I listened to his voice, full of background noise, clinking glasses, and laughter. He sounded relaxed. Like a man living the life he thought he'd built. I told him everything was fine. That dinner had turned out well. That I'd probably go to bed early. I ended the call and sat in the dark for a long time. There was a part of me that wanted to confess. Not everything. But something. A sliver of truth. Enough to shift the burden. But the silence that surrounded me was thick with years of swallowed truths. One more wouldn't change anything. Not yet. The next morning, I decided to go into town after all. I needed something, not groceries, not errands. Just air. Distance. Perspective. I walked through the small shops, fingers brushing sweaters I didn't need, candles I wouldn't light, books I wouldn't read. I paused in front of a boutique window, catching my reflection. I looked composed. Calm. But I knew better. Back at home, the mood felt different. Lighter. Almost as if the tension had broken, but not from confrontation, from exhaustion. We were both tired of pretending not to notice. That evening, I found a note on the kitchen counter. Went for a run. Be back in a bit. I held the note for a long time, unsure why it affected me the way it did. Maybe it was the casualness. The unspoken acknowledgement that we now existed in a space where updates mattered. Where presence and absence were noted. When he returned, he looked flushed from exertion. His hair was damp, his breath still slightly uneven. He smiled, nodded, and went to shower. Nothing more. But I watched him go, and something about that small moment, the simplicity of it, stirred something inside me I hadn't felt in years. Not desire. Not even longing. Just aliveness. Before bed, I stood at the bathroom mirror, wiping away the remnants of mascara and moisturizer, and stared at myself. This couldn't go on. Not like this. But even as I thought it, I knew the truth. It already was. I woke the next day to a sky washed in gray. The kind of muted light that makes the whole world feel soft and undecided, like everything is suspended between one thing and the next. I lingered in bed longer than usual, pretending I didn't hear the low sounds of breakfast being made downstairs. For a few minutes, I stared at the ceiling, letting the quiet wash over me in layers. Eventually, I got up, dressed slowly, and made my way to the kitchen. He was already there, pouring oats into a pot, his movements practiced, unfussy. He glanced up when I entered but didn't say anything right away. That was how we operated now, careful pauses, neutral tones, and just enough space between our words to convince ourselves we were still behaving. I thanked him when he passed me a cup of tea, and we stood in our usual silence as the oatmeal simmered. The kitchen smelled warm and clean, like cinnamon and soft routines. There was something oddly intimate in the smallness of that morning. No glances that lasted too long, no questions we weren't ready to answer. Just two people sharing space that had become something neither of us knew how to name. My husband was working from home that day. His voice carried down the hallway from the office, light and professional, full of words that sounded purposeful. It was a stark contrast to the weightless way we moved around one another in the kitchen, trying not to touch anything that might break. I spent the early part of the day reorganizing the guest room closet. Not that it needed it. But I needed a reason to be in that space again. I needed to reclaim it, to strip it of the memory that now hung in the air like stale perfume. I folded his clothes with too much care, as if each cotton shirt had become a fragile relic. At one point, I found a photo tucked inside one of his textbooks, a snapshot of him and my sister at a family picnic from years ago. Their arms were slung around each other, eyes squinting into the sun, faces full of that simple, easy kind of joy that seems harder to find with age. I held the photo for a long moment, unsure whether I was more haunted by who he was then or by the fact that he was still, somehow, that same person. In the afternoon, I needed to step out. I told myself it was for errands, but really, it was just to breathe without surveillance. I drove without a destination, letting the turns come as they pleased. I ended up at the town library, quiet, familiar, filled with that comforting smell of pages and dust. I wandered the aisles with my fingers grazing spines, but I didn't check out a single book. I just needed to be somewhere no one knew who I was or what I was unraveling. When I returned, I saw the neighbor again. She was standing in her yard, watering her plants, her expression unreadable. She didn't wave this time. Just looked. And that, more than anything, unsettled me. Inside the house, I could hear laughter from the living room. My husband and nephew were watching something together, the TV flickering and bouncing light across the walls. For a moment, it felt like an illusion of normalcy, like a family preserved in amber. But when I entered, my husband barely looked up. My nephew met my eyes for a second too long. I retreated to the kitchen, began preparing dinner, again, too much food, too many ingredients. Cooking had become my refuge, a ritual that gave my body a task so my thoughts didn't swallow me whole. As I chopped, I heard footsteps. He stood at the threshold again, watching. I didn't turn to face him. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, voice low enough that it didn't carry beyond the kitchen tiles. I stirred the pan in front of me. "That's dangerous." He gave a small breath of a laugh but didn't move closer. "I should move out," he said. "It's not right to keep staying here." My hand froze. I turned to look at him then. His face was calm, but his eyes held something deeper, resolve, maybe. Or resignation. "It's not because of anything you did," he added quickly. I think I've made things harder for you." I didn't mean to. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I could. Part of me wanted to agree. To nod and say, yes, this is the responsible thing. But another part, the quieter, more honest part, recoiled at the thought of him gone. The silence stretched, then I said, "Maybe it's not just you." He looked at me, and for once, neither of us tried to look away. That evening, we sat through dinner with the usual small talk. My husband chatted about someone's retirement party. I smiled, nodded, added a comment when appropriate. My nephew said little. His fork moved across his plate, but the food remained largely untouched. Afterward, I stood at the sink again, washing dishes by hand even though the dishwasher stood ready, waiting. I needed the rhythm, the noise, the excuse not to think. From the corner of my eye, I saw him pass behind me, pausing at the door. For a second, I thought he'd speak. But then he kept walking, footsteps fading up the stairs. My husband joined me in the kitchen a few minutes later, leaned against the counter, sipping the rest of his wine. He looked at me over the rim of the glass and said, "You've been quiet lately." I smiled, not because I meant it, but because it was easier than the truth. "Just tired." He nodded, as if that explained everything. Later, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. It had become a habit, a quiet space where I could process the noise of my own mind. I thought about what he said. About leaving. About how simple it would be to let him go. To let it end here, clean and quiet. But nothing about this had ever been clean. Or quiet. And I didn't know yet whether I wanted it to end at all. The invitation came on a Wednesday afternoon, folded neatly beside my husband's reading glasses on the kitchen table. A long weekend at the lake house, he'd said earlier that week, just the three of us, one last getaway before summer slipped into memory. I had nodded automatically at the time, thinking little of it. But now, holding the thick envelope in my hands and reading the scripted letters that promised rest and simplicity, I felt a tremor pass through me. I had not been to the lake house in nearly a year. It had once been a place of laughter and long afternoons, of grilled dinners and early morning swims. But over time, even that sanctuary had dulled. We stopped going. Or rather, we stopped going together. Life got in the way, or perhaps, we allowed it to. I placed the invitation back on the table and walked to the window. The backyard shimmered in the heat, the air above the concrete patio warping like a memory too long held. I didn't want to pack. I didn't want to sit in a car for hours pretending everything was the same. And I certainly didn't want to pretend that the three of us sharing a roof for a weekend was anything other than a risk. Still, the next morning, we packed. My husband handled the logistics. He checked the tire pressure, loaded the cooler, and made a mental list of groceries we'd need to pick up along the way. I watched him move through his tasks with the comfortable efficiency of a man who had done this before. Who believed this would be good for us? That we could still recover something. My nephew packed lightly, just a duffel and a book. He looked tired. Or maybe I was projecting. Either way, he said little as we loaded into the car and began the drive north. The first hour passed in silence, punctuated only by radio static and the occasional clearing of someone's throat. My husband hummed at times, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel, occasionally pointing out a landmark we'd seen 100 times before. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape roll by in streaks of green and gold, wondering how long I could hold my breath without anyone noticing. We arrived just before dusk. The lake house looked unchanged, weathered wood, chipped paint, the smell of pine and water in the air. There was a kind of nostalgia that clung to the place, but it was hollow. The porch creaked the same way it always had. The screen door still stuck at the top. The bedroom smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. But the weight inside me made the air feel heavier than I remembered. We spent the first evening unpacking and settling in. My husband turned on the old radio in the corner and poured himself a glass of scotch. He offered one to my nephew, who politely declined, then to me. I accepted out of habit, sipping slowly as the hum of the radio filled the space between our words. Dinner was simple. Pasta, salad, bread. We ate on the porch, the lake stretching out dark and quiet before us. Fireflies blinked in and out near the edge of the water. The sound of insects filled the pauses in conversation. It should have been peaceful. But underneath the surface, everything was tight. After dinner, my husband retreated inside to take a call. Something work-related, always work-related. I gathered the dishes, walking them to the sink. My nephew followed, wordless, and began rinsing them without needing to be asked. We moved in that same rhythm again. Quiet. Deliberate. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. The air was too charged, too full of all the things we weren't saying. When the last dish was done, I dried my hands on a towel and turned toward the porch. But he spoke first. You don't have to pretend. His voice was low, almost lost in the creak of the old house around us. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to. But because I didn't trust what would come out if I did. That night, the house creaked and sighed as it settled into the coolness of night. I lay in bed, the thin cotton sheets clinging to my skin. My husband snored softly beside me. I watched the ceiling, tracing the faint outlines of shadows left by the moonlight sneaking through the window blinds. I thought of leaving the room. Not to do anything. Just to breathe. Eventually, I did. I crept downstairs, feet bare against the cool wood, and stepped out onto the porch. The lake was a sheet of glass, reflecting the stars above in near-perfect symmetry. I sat in one of the old wicker chairs and wrapped my arms around myself. I didn't hear the door open behind me. But I felt him when he sat down in the chair beside mine. We didn't speak. For several long minutes, we just sat, watching the water. The silence between us was vast, but not empty. It was full of everything we'd held back, everything we hadn't dared to say. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper. "We can't keep doing this." I turned to him. His face was in shadow, but his voice carried everything I needed to know. "I know," I said. We sat a while longer. Then, without warning, he stood and walked back inside. I followed a few minutes later, careful not to wake anyone. But it was too late for caution. The next day unfolded like any other. Breakfast on the porch. A walk along the lake. My husband skipping stones across the surface while we watched from the dock. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. We spent the night together. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through the thin curtains of the lake house in quiet, gold-hued beams. I opened my eyes to a room that felt unfamiliar in its familiarity, the same ceiling fan, the same faint smell of aged wood and linen, but everything beneath it was altered now. I lay still for several moments, listening. The house was silent. No footsteps. No voices. Just the occasional groan of the old boards settling into daylight. My husband was already up. His side of the bed was empty and cool, the sheets smoothed down neatly. I sat up, brushing my hand over the blanket. There was no sign that anything had changed for him. Maybe it hadn't. Maybe it wouldn't. I dressed without thinking too much, pulling on jeans and a soft sweater I kept at the lake house for cooler mornings. As I stepped into the hallway, I was greeted by the scent of coffee brewing. The kitchen came into view slowly, like a scene unfolding on a stage, my husband at the table, reading something on his tablet, coffee steaming beside him. He looked up, smiled gently, and motioned to the counter. "Fresh pots on," he said. "Slept in, huh?" I smiled back and murmured something about the fresh air and the quiet. He nodded and returned to his screen. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him. Neither of us brought up the previous evening. It remained a closed drawer, not locked, but left untouched. My nephew came down a little while later. His presence in the room was quiet but weighted. He greeted us both, poured his own coffee, and stood by the window for a few minutes, gazing out over the lake. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. The echo of last night's silence, the way we'd simply acknowledged everything without saying a word, was still too loud in my head. We ate breakfast without fanfare. Toast, jam, a few pieces of fruit. My husband suggested a hike, something light before lunch. He seemed earnest in his desire to turn the weekend into something meaningful, and I didn't have the energy to refuse. We hiked the loop around the northern ridge, a path we'd walked dozens of times before. My husband took the lead, map in hand, enthusiastically pointing out markers and old trail signs. My nephew walked a few paces behind me. We barely exchanged a glance, and still, the air between us thrummed with memory. At the highest point of the trail, the trees opened to reveal the lake below, glistening in the midday sun. My husband offered to take a photo. I smiled dutifully as he framed the shot, his arm casually around my shoulder. My nephew stood just beside me, our arms nearly brushing. After the photo, we stood looking down at the lake. There was a breeze, cool and unexpected, and I welcomed the way it made my skin feel awake again. When we returned to the cabin, my husband went into town to pick up a few things we'd forgotten. He offered to take us along, but I claimed I needed a shower, and my nephew said he wanted to rest. The moment the car rolled away down the gravel drive, the silence that followed felt like a held breath. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, unsure what to do with myself. Then I moved to the sink and began washing the few dishes left from breakfast, scrubbing harder than necessary, each movement mechanical and sharp. He came in quietly, standing behind me. I could feel him before I saw him. His presence wasn't intrusive, it never had been, but it was unmistakable. "I should have left last month," he said, voice steady but soft. I didn't answer. "I knew it was getting complicated," he added. I stayed because I didn't want to admit it. I turned off the water, set the sponge down, and faced him. His eyes searched mine, not for permission, not for blame, just for understanding. "It already happened," I said. He nodded. "I know." We stood in that kitchen, surrounded by sunlight and the scent of lemon dish soap, and nothing else needed to be said. Later, I sat on the back porch alone, watching the wind stir through the tall grass. The lake rippled softly, the surface catching fragments of sky and scattering them like glass. It looked peaceful. Untouched. But I knew how quickly still water could be disturbed. My husband returned an hour later, brown paper bags in his arms, talking cheerfully about the farmer's market and a woman who sold homemade honey. He handed me a jar and kissed my cheek, his lips cool from the outside air. I smiled and told him it sounded lovely. That evening, we grilled dinner, vegetables, fish, potatoes wrapped in foil. The kind of meal that required cooperation and conversation. It went smoothly. My husband poured wine. My nephew set the table. I lit candles and pretended that everything still belonged in its place. After the meal, as dusk settled over the lake and the air grew cooler, we moved back to the porch with our glasses in hand. My husband talked about memories from past summers, boating, thunderstorms, the time the dock had come loose and floated halfway across the lake. I listened. I laughed in the right places. My nephew listened too, occasionally adding a detail or asking a question. He played his part well. The stars came out slowly, shy at first, then bold. The moon was low and orange, casting a warm haze over the water. It was beautiful. Painfully so. When we finally said goodnight, my husband went upstairs first. I lingered, pretending to blow out the candles, checking the latch on the screen door. My nephew stood at the foot of the stairs, waiting. "I'll leave when we get back," he said quietly. I nodded. I didn't ask where he'd go. As I climbed the stairs, each step felt heavier than the last. The walls of the lake house seemed to breathe with the weight of everything they'd seen. I crawled into bed beside my husband. He was already asleep, one arm thrown over his chest, mouth slightly open. The soft sound of his breathing filled the room. I closed my eyes and let the darkness settle around me. But rest didn't come. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't expect it to. We left the lake house on a Sunday morning painted with pale mist and soft, colorless light. The lake itself was still, a thin veil of fog hovering just above its surface like something too delicate to disturb. The drive home began in silence, all three of us weighed down by something that had no name but lived heavily in our bones. My husband drove, humming now and then, fingers tapping the steering wheel in time with music that played low from the radio. I sat beside him, hands folded in my lap, the seatbelt across my chest like a boundary I dared not cross. In the back seat, my nephew looked out the window, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. The road unfurled behind us, taking with it the quiet ache of the cabin, the slowness of the weekend, the night that had passed between him and me like a tremor through soil. We didn't speak about it. Not on the porch the next morning. Not in the kitchen as we packed. Not in the moment when our hands brushed one last time over the handle of a shared bag. There was nothing left to say. And yet, everything remained unsaid. When we arrived home, the silence fractured slightly. My husband yawned and announced he was going to lie down for a while. I nodded and offered to unpack the car. My nephew took his bag and disappeared into the guest room. I moved through the familiar rhythm of returning, sorting laundry, wiping surfaces, opening windows. But everything felt foreign now. The house wasn't the same. Or maybe I wasn't. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, holding one of his shirts in my lap. Not my husband's. His. Soft cotton, slightly wrinkled, carrying the faint scent of cedar and summer air. I folded it slowly, precisely, then placed it back in his bag. He'd said he would leave after the weekend. I hadn't asked for a timeline. I still didn't know if I wanted one. The knock on the bedroom door was quiet. I looked up. He stood there, not stepping inside, just watching me with that careful expression I'd come to recognize. Thoughtful. Tired. Controlled. "I'm heading out soon," he said. I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't stand. I only nodded. The air between us was too fragile now for more than that. "I'll call my mom once I get settled," he added. "So she knows where I am." Another nod. I wanted to say something, anything, that wouldn't sound like a goodbye. But no words came. He lingered for a moment longer, then offered a faint smile and turned away. I listened to his footsteps down the hall, then the front door opening and closing. I waited for the sound of the engine. When it came, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He was gone. I remained in the bedroom for a long time, the silence around me more complete than ever. There were no distractions left. No glances to avoid. No footsteps to anticipate. Just stillness. And the faint echo of choices I could no longer rewrite. That evening, my husband cooked dinner. He moved around the kitchen with purpose, pulling ingredients from the fridge, chopping vegetables, humming under his breath. He talked about a colleague who was retiring soon. About a new client who wanted to redo their entire backyard. About how maybe, next summer, we should think about traveling again. I nodded where I was supposed to. Laughed once. But my thoughts drifted like loose thread unraveling from a sleeve. I watched his hands as he worked. Familiar hands. Steady. Reliable. And yet, somewhere in all their steadiness, I had been lost. We ate quietly. He complimented the food, smiled across the table, refilled my glass without being asked. There was a strange gentleness in him that evening. Something attentive. I wondered if he sensed it, some shift in the air, in me. Or maybe he was trying. Maybe this was his way of reaching for something that had long since slipped between us. After dinner, I cleaned the dishes alone. I needed the noise, the movement, the excuse not to sit still. When I finished, I stepped outside for a breath of air. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a faint pink smear across the sky. The street was quiet. The neighbor's porch light flickered on. She stood there, watering her plants, same as always. When she looked up and saw me, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze lingered a second too long. Then she turned back to her flowers. I stayed outside until the light faded completely. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. The room felt cold, though the air was warm. I closed my eyes and tried to find rest, but every time I drifted close, something pulled me back. The weight of what had happened. The fear of what would come next. The knowledge that nothing could be undone. In the dark, I thought about the weeks before. The way everything had unfolded, not with fire but with a slow erosion. How small moments, glances, words, silences, had built into something I couldn't ignore. I hadn't gone looking for any of it. But I hadn't stopped it either. I thought about my nephew's last glance before he left. About the way his voice had sounded, grateful, regretful, restrained. I wondered where he was now. If he felt relieved. Or empty. Or both. And I thought about the woman I had been before all of this began. The woman who folded towels and packed lunches and slept beside a man who didn't know she was drifting. I wondered if she could come back. I wasn't sure I wanted her to. The house felt different now. Too quiet. Too clean. Like a stage cleared after the final act. In the silence, I reached for the comfort of certainty, but found only the hollow echo of decisions made in borrowed moments. And I knew, deep down, that nothing, not time, not distance, not silence, could put everything back where it once was. The following days unfolded like a slow rain, steady, quiet, and inevitable. Nothing dramatic happened. No confrontations, no raised voices, no discoveries or demands. Just time, pressing itself around me like fog. The kind that doesn't blind you, but makes every step feel uncertain. I moved through the hours with care, each motion deliberate, each conversation with my husband soft-edged and brief. He remained kind, attentive even, asking if I wanted to take a walk, if I needed anything from the store, if I was sleeping better. I told him I was fine. And in a way, I was. At least on the surface. The rhythm of life returned with its usual structure, grocery lists, folded laundry, emails unanswered for too long. But even the simplest tasks carried a hum beneath them now, like a low static that never quite faded. I kept catching myself in reflective surfaces, mirrors, windows, the back of a spoon, and pausing for a second too long. I didn't recognize the woman staring back, not entirely. She looked like me, but older somehow. Not in the sense of age, but in the sense of knowing something she hadn't before. Of having crossed a line and realizing that, no matter how carefully she walked from now on, she would always remember the sound it made beneath her feet. One afternoon, I found a letter in the mail addressed to me in familiar handwriting. It was from my nephew. No return address, just a few simple lines written on thick paper. He didn't mention what had happened. He didn't apologize or ask for anything. It was simply a thank you, for the time, for the space, for helping him figure something out about himself. He hoped I was well. That I was at peace. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't write back. A week later, my husband surprised me with plans for dinner. Not just takeout or a quiet evening at home, but an actual reservation at a restaurant we hadn't been to in years. The kind of place we used to go when everything still felt new. I didn't ask why. I knew better. Sometimes gestures mean more than explanations. I got ready slowly that evening, choosing a blouse I hadn't worn in a long time, brushing my hair with more care than usual. When I entered the hallway, he looked up and smiled genuinely, without effort. "You look beautiful," he said. And I thanked him. Dinner was pleasant. We talked about light things, neighbors, news, the changing weather. At one point, he reached across the table to hold my hand. I let him. His fingers were warm, familiar, grounding. I didn't pull away. But even as we sat there, surrounded by candlelight and the low hum of other diners, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had settled. Not in a comfortable way. More like the way ash settles after a fire, soft, silent, final. On the drive home, we passed the neighborhood where we first lived after getting married. The grocery store we used to walk to together. The bakery that used to know our names. I looked out the window, letting the memories slide past like shadows. I remembered the early days, messy, uncertain, full of noise and hope. Back when everything still felt possible. When we used to argue and then laugh minutes later. When silence was rare, not routine. That night, after we returned home and he'd gone to bed, I stayed up for a while, standing in the kitchen with the lights off. I watched the digital clock on the stove shift slowly from 1 minute to the next. I opened the back door and stepped outside barefoot, letting the cold tiles shock me awake. The night air was crisp, and the sky was heavy with stars. It was quiet, almost reverent. In the garden, the rose bush we'd planted years ago had begun to bloom again. A few early petals clung stubbornly to the stems, fragile against the wind. I crouched down beside it, ran my fingers lightly over a thorn, and felt a sudden sting as the skin of my fingertip split. A thin bead of blood welled up, bright and alive. I stared at it, transfixed. The pain wasn't sharp. Just enough to remind me I was still here. That I could still feel. In the following days, I began rearranging things. Small changes. I moved the living room chair to the other side of the room. I donated clothes I hadn't worn in years. I changed the way I organized the pantry. My husband noticed but didn't say much. He adjusted. He always had. One morning, I took down the framed photo of us from our anniversary trip and replaced it with a watercolor I'd painted in a class I once took on a whim. It was abstract, uneven, but it made me feel something when I looked at it. He noticed that too. Still, he said nothing. Weeks passed. Slowly. Quietly. Steadily. Then, one afternoon, as I was watering the plants on the front porch, I saw her again, our neighbor. She stood across the fence, sunglasses resting atop her head, a cup of tea in hand. She watched me for a moment, then raised her hand in a half-wave. "You look rested," she said. I paused, unsure what to say. "New color on your porch chairs," she added. I glanced at them. I hadn't even noticed they'd faded. "Maybe it's just the light," I said. She nodded, then took a sip of her tea. "I always find it interesting," she said slowly, "how some things fade quietly. And some things don't fade at all. They just change." I looked at her then. She wasn't smiling. But she wasn't accusing either. Just observing. "Change can be good," I said. "Sometimes," she replied. And then she turned and walked away. I stood there for a long time, hose still in hand, the water pooling at my feet. Her words echoed, not in threat, not in judgment, but as a truth I hadn't yet said aloud. Things had changed. Not just between me and him. Not just within our home. Within me. And maybe the story didn't need to end in disaster or confession or some great unraveling. Maybe it was enough that I had changed. That I had seen myself again, clearly, even if just for a moment. Maybe that was what I needed most. Not redemption. Not punishment. But recognition. And as I stood there beneath the soft sun of a late afternoon, the scent of earth and rosemary in the air, I let myself believe that this quiet, imperfect life, could still be mine to choose.